then this is what we have come to that stage. Now I have to talk to you about two very important subjects, which of course I skipped while dealing with the scrutiny and then other things. One is the qualifications and disqualifications, because it needed a special talk. Similarly, the allotment of symbols, which is a very important stage in the process. I will tell you about the qualifications and disqualifications. As I told you in the beginning, qualifications and disqualifications are two different concepts. They are not same. Lack of qualification is not a disqualification. Qualifications and disqualifications are two different concepts. Constitution itself has made the distinction. If you see Article 84 of the Constitution, that lays down the qualifications for membership of Parliament. And if you see Article 102, that lays down separately the disqualifications for elections to Parliament. Similarly, if you see Article 173, that lays down the qualifications for elections to the state legislatures, and 191 lays down the disqualifications for state legislatures. So 84 and 173, they lay down the qualifications for Parliament and state legislatures. 102 and 191, they lay down the disqualifications for state legislature. Let me first talk to you about the qualifications. If you see Article 84, the first requirement in Article 84 and also in 173A, because they are actually identical, because they are coming in different, in the Constitution there is a division. Something is being said about Parliament, another thing is being said about the state legislatures. Even where they wanted to repeat those things, they have put in the different parts and the different articles. So otherwise these particular provisions are almost identical. There the word used is Parliament, there the word used is state legislature. So Article 84 and 173, first requirement in that article is that a person should be citizen of India. Then the second requirement or the qualification in that very article is that he must make an oath or affirmation to bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution. Then third is the minimum qualifying age. Then fourth, those articles, both articles say that the Parliament may from time to time prescribe additional qualifications. So I will now deal with all these four things separately. First is the citizenship of India, that is the first qualification. So in the Constitution itself there are certain provisions as to who shall be regarded as the citizens of India. That qualification is given, or that citizenship is given to those persons who were physically present in India on the 26th January 1950. So those who were born before 26th January 1950 in any part of India which was undivided, or if anybody born outside but his parents were born in India, or if somebody was living for 5 years at least in India, this citizenship was conferred on them by the Constitution itself in Article 5. But then the question was, what will happen with regard to those who were born on 26th January or thereafter up to today. So for that Parliament, the Constitution said that the Parliament will make law, and then that law is Citizenship Act of 1955. So this Citizenship Act of 1955 applies to all those who were born either on 26th January 1950 or thereafter. And section 345, these are the three sections basically in that particular act which give the citizenship to Indians. 3 speaks about the birth, then 4th speaks about the domicile, and then the fifth means registration. So, what was the basically all people who were born, that was given as the citizenship under section 3. Fourth and fifth will not be having any problems for you, because there the Home Ministry will give you the certificate of registration, whether as a domicile person or as a registration by virtue of marriage, etc., etc. That certificate is given by. So, the difficulty arises with regard to the persons who are covered by section 3, and section 3 up to 1st July 1987 was very simple. Whosoever is born in India, anywhere in India, he becomes a citizen just by birth, whether his father was a citizen or he is a Bangladeshi or an alien or a coming from Pakistan, or if he is shown that he was born anywhere in India, he got the citizenship by birth. Then so many problems arose, and then difficulty arose. Ultimately 1986, then Citizenship Act was amended, and it was provided that any person who is born in India after 1st July 1987, by birth alone he will not become a citizen of India, unless either his mother or father is a citizen of India at the time of his birth. Then two qualifications: he should be born in India, and either his father or his mother should also be a citizen of India at the time of his birth. Then only he will become a citizen of India. So, this was the change. Then some other changes were also made with regard to those who came from Bangladesh by a particular date. A special provision was made for them. So, those who may be dealing with the elections in Assam, they may be required with that for special provision in forms rules section 6A, etc. That of course is a very technical thing. So, I would not like to confuse you with that one. So, here basically is by birth, whosoever is born in India up to 1st July, before 1st July 87 by birth, and those who are born after the 1st July 87 birth, and the citizenship of mother or father. And then Supreme Court has also said one thing, that if somebody says that no, he is not a citizen of India, they have said that supposing there is a person who has been regarded as a citizen of India in the past, and then somebody says no, he has ceased to be a citizen because he has gone to England or he has got there, then there they have said that the RO or the other authorities are not required to go into that question. This can be decided only by the Home Ministry. So, the Home Ministry under the Citizenship Act has to say yes, he has ceased to be a citizen of India. Otherwise, for your purpose, he is a citizen of India once he is shown that he has been accepted as a citizen of India. So, that of course is creating several complications, but we are not concerned now. We are not the authority to settle those controversies. But at the same time, they have also said that you cannot simply say that no, it is for the government to decide. So, if some question arises, you have also to apply your mind whether a person who claims to be a citizen of India is a citizen of India or not. So, supposing somebody raises a doubt, then we have to simply, we cannot brush aside that issue. Then next requirement in the constitution is that every candidate must make an oath or affirmation. Oath is always in the name of God, and affirmation somebody may not like to take the oath if he say I solemnly affirm. So, every candidate has to make an oath or affirmation, and for that a particular form is prescribed in the constitution itself. If we see the third schedule to the constitution, there are several forms of oath prescribed for judges of the Supreme Court, for other dignitaries, and then there are two forms prescribed for oath by the candidate, one by the candidate before he contests the election, at the time of the contesting election, another for that candidate who wins and wants to take a seat in the house. But we are concerned here only with the oath which he has to take as a candidate, and for that there are forms 3A and 7A. 3A is for Lok Sabha, 7A is for the assemblies in that particular schedule, and those forms you have to keep sufficiently in sufficient quantity printed in advance, because the candidates will come to you, you have to administer the oath to them. So, you have to be ready with those forms, and though the form is smaller, but we from the election commission side, we have added something at the bottom to show when he made the oath, before whom he made the oath. That particular revised format is given in the returning officer's handbook. So, I think they are all centrally printed and the chief electoral officer will give you. So, that form has to be filled by the candidate, and there are 2-3 requirements for that particular oath. Firstly, the oath has to be read out by the man. He cannot simply just sign and then give it to you, because the law says shall make and subscribe. They have said make means he has to read out, and then subscribe means he has to put his signature. And supposing somebody is illiterate, then in that case you will have to tell him that I am reading out, you just follow me and you repeat those things. Otherwise it is not the administration. In the administration of the oath, somebody first reads it out and the other repeats it, in the case of this chief minister or ministers or so. But here they say makes, he himself has to read out and then make subscribe. So, you will be giving him that form, he will read out and then he will put his signature, and then below that you will have to sign, yes, he signed, he made this oath in my presence at this time and at this hour. Because here also this time and date is very important for 2 reasons, I will tell you. The purpose is that somebody must say that I am going to be a candidate, and if elected I will uphold the sovereignty, unity, integrity of the country, and I will uphold the principles of secularism, democracy. So, that is the purpose, and so a form is prescribed. Then this oath can be taken before whom? The article 84 and 173 itself says shall be made before such officer or such person whom the election commission authorizes. So, we have given an authorization. If you find if you see the returning officer's handbook, in that there is a complete order which was issued way back in 1968 and it is still continuing. In that particular order we have said that the first person before whom the oath can be made is the returning officer of the constituency, and here before the ARO also, and here we are not saying the only that ARO who has been authorized, here all AROs we have said, if there are 3 AROs, before anyone he can go and then he can make and subscribe that oath. Then of course magistrates and the judicial officers. Then there may be a situation where a person may be confined in a prison, he may be undergoing some imprisonment or may be under trial prisoner and he wants to contest. So, he can take the oath before the superintendent of the jail, in which case we have given the instructions to the superintendents that as soon as the oath is made before him, he has to give a written, or now of course email and all those things are very easy. So, he can immediately give you a intimation through email, fax or anything that this man who is confined in my prison, he has made the oath at this time and at this hour. And then it will be the responsibility of the candidate to present that particular form in original before the RO. but at the same time the superintendent must also help him. Supposing superintendent does not help him and then does not allow anybody to go to the prison and he can't even hand over that form to anybody. So our instructions to the these superintendents of jails are there that you extend every help, and sometimes we have found even in the last election in Manipur, somebody contested election from Tihar jail in Delhi. In Manipur he contested. So we made arrangements for those oath forms to be sent to Manipur. This is one. Then thirdly, another situation where person may be under preventive detention. So there also the whosoever is the in charge of that detention camp, before him also the oath can be taken. Then fourth, there may be where a person may be confined in a hospital, may be undergoing some treatment or may be undergoing treatment in his own house and some medical practitioner may be attending on him. So we have authorized them also. So they can also administer the oath, or before them also the oath can be taken, but the original form they have to produce before you at the time of scrutiny. Then sometimes it may so happen that a person may be outside, he may not be available in India on the date of the nominations. So we have said that the diplomatic or the consular representative of India in that country can also is also the person before whom this oath can be taken. And of course, in case any person has any other difficulty, then if he comes to us, we can even nominate somebody to specially administer the oath to him. So these are the only persons before whom the oath can be made and subscribed. Now the next question will be, oath or affirmation when can be made? There previously there was some doubt, but now that doubt has been clarified by the Supreme Court in 2-3 judgments. The oath form, they have said a candidate nominated for so and so. The Supreme Court has then said nominated means a person who has filed his nomination paper with the RO. A person may have been, say, proposed by some persons, he is keeping that nomination paper still in his pocket. He cannot come and say, no, you please allow me to take the oath. First he has to give his nomination paper and then he becomes a candidate nominated and then he can take the oath. So the nomination, that is why another I told you that you have to on the nomination paper you have to give the date and time, exact time. This is very relevant because the oath can be 1 minute or say half a minute later than the presentation, but it can't be before the presentation. So that is very important. Once he has given the nomination paper to you, then he can make the oath, not earlier than that. Then the last date, he may not be immediately available, he may be sending his nomination paper through his proposer. So the oath can be made by him only before the commencement of the date of scrutiny. Commencement of the date means right up to the end of the day. So even up to 12 o'clock, supposing the scrutiny is to take place on a particular day, say 10th January. So up to 9th January, 12 o'clock in the night, he can make and subscribe the oath. That is the, but as soon as 10th January has started, the date of scrutiny has started, then he cannot take the oath. So these are the two termini. After he has presented the nomination paper to you and before the date of scrutiny has commenced at the dead of that midnight, he has to take oath between those two periods. And then of course in one case Supreme Court has also said that if a person is contesting from two constituencies, then if he has taken the oath in one and he satisfies the RO in the other one that I have taken the oath in the second constituency, he need not be asked to take the oath again. So supposing he has given 4 nomination papers, it is not necessary that for every nomination paper he must make the oath again and again. So one oath is enough for all the nomination papers. But Supposing he is contesting election from Lok Sabha and also he is contesting election for assembly, then he has to make 2 oaths because the forms are also different. One he will make the oath as a Lok Sabha candidate, the other oath he will take as a assembly candidate. This I have already told you that he can't simply just sign and then give it to you, he has to read out and then sign. And normally in the case of the administration of oath, both are standing and then one man is reading. So in one case the RO was sitting and the candidate read out, then some question arose, no, this is not the oath, because court said no, it is not necessary that the RO should also stand up. He is sitting and he is reading out and signing. One thing we have also prescribed, that supposing the candidate is not there, he has sent his nomination through some proposer, and so he should not be taken by surprise, saying that at the time of scrutiny you have not taken the oath. So we want you to give him a reminder. For that, in the returning officer's handbook there is a letter prescribed. So you just keep those letters ready. As soon as somebody is there, you just fill the name, and whosoever has come to give the nomination paper, you hand over a copy of that to him, say, so that tomorrow he may not say that I was not told. And this we gave because in one case we found that the candidates, all candidates except the candidate of one particular party, they were all kept in the dark that you have to take the oath. So on the date of scrutiny only one was accepted, all others were rejected, so they had become an uncontested election. In a state which was a very new one, where the people were not properly informed, this mischief was played. Then now we come to the next qualification, which is the age qualification. As I said, age qualification is 25 years, both for Lok Sabha and for assembly. Though the voting age is 18, and now people are saying that you reduce, but the constitution says still 25 years. And as I have previously said, this age is to be seen on the date of scrutiny of nominations, not on the date when he filed the nomination paper. So if on the date of scrutiny he is 25, you will take him as a qualified candidate. And then in one case, what happened, of course now the time has changed, I do not know, the courts may take a different view, but in one case the nomination paper, in the nomination paper, the man had not put his age in the nomination paper, because there is a column, I have completed this year this much number of years, he had not put. So the nomination was rejected. Supreme Court said yes, it is a defect of substantial character. So I am not sure whether that judgment given in 71 will still be applicable now, because in another case there was another case where the candidate had not said that I belong to this particular scheduled tribe. That is also a requirement to be fulfilled in the nomination paper, but Supreme Court took a liberal view, saying that these people are not well properly educated, but he has annexed a copy of the scheduled tribe certificate with his nomination paper. From that the RO could see that he belongs to that, he should not have rejected. So you just be sure that if such a situation is there, you better at the time of the presentation itself you can just check and say you have not completed this column, so better you do that. Then in that case I have told you, Article 84 and 173, they say that Parliament may prescribe additional qualifications from time to time, because they did not want any, and there is a lot of discussion now going on whether the Parliament should say that a person should be educationally qualified up to a particular level. Lot of discussion is going on, but that has not been decided so far. So the Parliament is empowered, and Parliament is empowered both for state legislatures and also for a Parliament, not merely for Parliament alone. And in that particular this exercise of this power, they have added only 2 qualifications. Basically they are, these qualifications are, section 4 is for the Lok Sabha and 5 is for the assembly. Section 4 and 5 of the 51 Act This says that in the case of a Lok Sabha election, a person should be registered elector anywhere except except 3 places. So Sikkim, they have made a special, he should be a registered voter in Sikkim. For Lakshadweep also they have said he should be a registered voter in Lakshadweep, and also in some autonomous districts of Assam. Otherwise in the entire India, a person can contest Lok Sabha election from anywhere and he may be registered as a voter in anywhere. Similarly, in the case of the Legislative Assembly, they have said that a person may be a registered voter anywhere in this state. So it is not necessary that in that constituency or in the district or in the, a person contesting an election to the Tamil Nadu Legislative Assembly may be a voter anywhere registered in Tamil Nadu. And second qualification they have laid down, that if the seat is reserved for SC or STs, then he must be an SC or ST. If it is reserved for SC, he must be an SC. If it is reserved for the STs, he must be an ST. And in the case of Lok Sabha, they have very clearly said that he may be an SC or ST in any other state also. Supposing somebody is contesting election from say a state A and he belongs to a scheduled caste, which is not a scheduled caste in state A, but he is a scheduled caste from state B, then he can also contest election Lok Sabha. But in the case of assembly, if he is contesting election from the SC or ST, he should be an SC or ST of that particular state, because for every state the president has issued an order specifying certain castes and tribes as the castes and tribes for that particular state. So a person contesting election in Tamil Nadu, he must be an SC or ST in Tamil Nadu. A person contesting election in Maharashtra, he must be an SC or ST of Maharashtra for the Legislative Assembly. For Lok Sabha there is no precedent. So this is what they have laid down as the qualifications, additional qualifications so far. Yeah, now we come to disqualifications. Disqualifications are contained in article 102 and 191, 102 for Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and 191 for the state legislatures. There basically 4 disqualifications the the Constitution has laid down in the Constitution itself, and then they have provided that the additional disqualifications may be made by Parliament from time to time. So the first disqualification they have made is an office of profit under the government. Second disqualification they have said unsoundness of mind. Third is undischarged insolvent. Fourth is non-citizenship of India. Of course, it is a qualification also, but they took additional thing and then they say non-citizenship is a disqualification also. Or a person may be having some allegiance or acknowledgement of adherence to a foreign state. Then also, though he may be a citizen of India, yet he will be disqualified for election as member of Lok Sabha, a member of Parliament or state legislature, and then any other disqualification. So now I will deal one by one. First is the office of profit, and it is a very ticklish problem, because so many questions arise whether this person is holding an office of profit under the government or under the government of any state or not. So several questions arose, and there are so many judgments of the Supreme Court that it is very difficult in fact. Then in one case, of course, they have ultimately, it is a very old case, very long history, but they have laid down certain principles, and if any question arises, then you have to apply those tests whether this can be said to be an office of profit under the government. First is who makes the appointment, whether the government is making the appointment or somebody else is making the appointment. If the appointment is made by the government, then the first test is satisfied. Then if the government has made the appointment, whether they have the power to remove him or whether they have the power to continue him, or can just their hands are tied. No, once appointment is made, then they have no right, then it may not be a office of profit under the government. Then third, they have said, who pays the remuneration, whether the government or some other authority, but there they have also, Supreme Court in that very case they have said, the source from which the payment of remuneration is made is not very material, but what the functions of the holder are, then whether the government exercises any control, these are all the things to be kept together, but basically who makes the appointment and who has the power to continue in that way, that is the main determining factor. I will give you some example. Supposing there is a government company or a corporation, we have now hundreds of corporations. The government makes the appointment of the, say, chairman or the director, and then the government has the power to remove him or to continue him or to dismiss him from that particular post. That will be taken as a office of profit and the office under the government. But in the same company there may be several other junior officers who are not being appointed by the government, because they have drawn a distinction between the government. They may be appointed by a board of directors, there may be some select appointment committee, or there may be some other director who may be made the director of personnel. So there the courts have drawn a distinction. He is not being appointed by the government, he is being appointed by the company, which is a separate entity. So in the case of the lower employees, they have said they are not holding office of profit under the government, whereas the director or the chairman who has been directly appointed by the government, he is the holder of office under the government. So this you will have to always keep in mind, who makes the appointment, whether the government has nominated or appointed him as a director or as a chairman or as secretary, or the appointment has been made by the company's own secretariat or some own offices. So LICs or some other, they have come out with some decisions. So the determining factor is who has made the appointment, and then who is making the payment also. Supposing a corporation has been set up, the government appoints the chairman, but then the government can remove the chairman also, but they say that payment shall be made by the corporation from its own funds. So that is not, they have said, that is not a determining factor, that is relevant but not the determining factor, because the payment may be, he is drawing the profit by virtue of his appointment by the government. So that is the office which is giving him some benefit, and that appointment or that post he is holding because of the government's this courtesy, and the main idea is that there should not be a conflict of interest between the member of parliament or member of legislature, and he should not feel beholden to the state government because who has made the appointment to him. So this is the principle. And then there is one thing more, it is not merely an office or office under the government, there should be some profit also. And you will see somewhere they may say, yes, he will be chairman but he will not draw any salary. So in that case it is an office under the government, but it is not an office of profit, because he has not been given any salary or anything. So sometimes they may say he will draw only the compensatory allowance for attending the meetings, or he may be provided transport from his house to his office for attending the meeting. So Supreme Court has said these are not the sources of profit for him. So he may be office holder, he may be holding an office under the government, but there is no profit. So it is very ticklish. So you have to keep decide these issues on a very, and in one case I tell you a very interesting case, Vice Chancellor of a university, he has been appointed by the governor, and he draws salary, everything it says, but the Supreme Court has said no, it is not an office under the government, because the governor is appointing him not as the governor of the state, but as the chancellor of the university. So, the capacity in which he has made the appointment is not the government authority, but because by virtue of some act he is the chancellor of the university. So, the chancellor has made the appointment, not the governor of the state. So, there they have said he is not holding, vice chancellor is not holding an office of. Similarly, that then again they have said that if a person is elected, say maybe a mayor of a particular city, or even the members of parliament, they are holding office, they are drawing profit also so many, but they are not being appointed by the government. So, they are not holding office under the government, because the government is not making the appointment. Similarly, sarpanches and the mayors or other corporation members, etc., they are not holding office of profit. So, this is what you have to decide. But one thing more very crucial, Parliament in this particular this constitution itself in this article has said that the Parliament and the state legislatures are empowered to remove disqualification in respect of certain offices. They may feel that this is an office of profit, we are making the appointment, yet we require his services or the services of a particular group of persons, keeping in view certain special circumstances. So, the Parliament and state legislatures, they have been empowered under this article to exempt certain offices. So, Parliament and all the state legislatures, they have passed separate acts removing the disqualification for in respect of certain offices. So, Parliament has passed an act which is known as the Parliament Prevention of Disqualification Act 1959, and all state legislatures, they have removed disqualifications in respect of their own state legislature. But one thing you must keep in mind here, Parliament has passed the law which removes the disqualification for election to Parliament, and state legislatures have passed the laws with regard to certain offices which remove the disqualification for state legislatures. It is quite possible that the Parliament may have exempted some office, but the state legislature may not have exempted that very office. So, if you are the RO for the parliamentary constituency, you will look into the parliamentary law, and if the exemption is there, you will say it is not holding. But if you are the RO for the assembly constituency, you have to see the state law, and if somebody says no, just see madam, this Parliament has dismoved, you say no, this is only applicable to Parliament, not to the state legislature. So, this is how you have to deal with that question of disqualification for office of profit under the government. Then next disqualification in the constitution is mentioned as a person who is of unsound mind. Merely somebody says ye to, in Hindi we say to pagal hai, we do not accept that statement. It has to be a declaration by the competent court. There is a lunacy act, and there is a procedure prescribed. So, if somebody says that this particular person is of unsound mind, the man has to produce a certificate of that particular court, or that whatever this medical board, etc., they constitute under that act, a certificate has to be produced. Then next in the absence of the certificate, we will not treat him as a person of unsound mind. Similarly, the word used is undischarged insolvent. See, in the first one, it is very clearly the Supreme Court has the constitution itself has said, declared so by the competent court. But in the case of undischarged insolvent, the only word they have used is undischarged insolvent. So, undischarged insolvent does not mean that anybody who has been failing in the making of payments to certain debts or to some, again Supreme Court by a judgment has said that undischarged insolvent is one who has been declared as insolvent under the Insolvency Act and who has not been discharged under that act so far. So, only that man merely a person has failed to make some payments to a say bank or so, that may be an act of insolvency, but commission of that act by itself is not a disqualification. A declaration by the court of the insolvency court is necessary, and this judgment I have quoted there, this is what they have said. Before actually this judgment came, this similar case arose before the election commission where we gave this very judgment, and now Supreme Court has rather confirmed that one. And then this one, this non-citizenship of course no one can say that I am not a citizen, still I want to contest. Then there are two things, then a person may be a citizen of India, but still he may be under acknowledgement of allegiance to a foreign state or adherence to a foreign state. So far in the history of this 60 years, only one case has arisen so far, and that arose from Tamil Nadu itself. There was one MLA by the name of Mr. K.S. Haja Sharif. He was an MLA in Tamil Nadu Legislative Assembly, and he was appointed as a honorary consul of Turkey. Turkish government appointed him for performance of certain commercial transactions or some other things. So he was appointed as the consul general of Turkey in Madras at that time. Yeah. So the question arose whether he is acknowledging any allegiance or adherence to this Turkish state. Then that question came before the election commission because he was a sitting MLA. So we have to decide. Then we said yes, after studying what are his functions, what he has to do as a Turkish consul. So we said yes, by acceptance of this particular office, he has shown his allegiance to adherence to the Turkish state, so he is disqualified. He went to the Madras High Court, and then of course Madras High Court upheld our decision. So far this is the only case on this particular issue. Then we come to the disqualifications which are to be additionally prescribed by Parliament. So there are 6 disqualifications. So there are 6 disqualifications which the Parliament has prescribed. They are to be found in sections 8, 8A, 9, 9A, 10 and 10A of the Representation of the People Act 1951. They are common both for Parliament and for state legislatures. So if any question arises, you have to just look at those, whether he is a parliamentary candidate or he is a assembly candidate, you have to see. First disqualification is on ground of conviction for certain offences. Second is disqualification on ground of commission of corrupt practice. He has contested a previous election, he committed some corrupt practice, and then High Court or the Supreme Court found yes, he committed that corrupt practice. So he becomes disqualified for some time in future. Then next is disqualification for dismissal, that I have already told you. If within 5 years somebody has been dismissed, then he has to produce a certificate from us that it was a dismissal but not for disloyalty or corruption. So unless he produces that certificate, he will not be deemed to be properly nominated. Then the next is disqualification for holding office under government company. I will tell you about this also, but because we have said office under the government, this is an additional, that is under the constitution, this is under the statutory law. Then last is the disqualification for failure to lodge accounts of election expenses. Then now we come to the first disqualification, inviting disqualification and conviction. That is specified. If somebody has been convicted, you have to immediately look into section 8, because every conviction does not attract disqualification. In section 8 there are 3 types of convictions which are mentioned. In the first section itself there are certain sections specified. If anybody is convicted under those 10 or 12 offences are specified. If a person is convicted for any of those offences, even if he has been fined ₹1 only, or maybe sentenced only till the rising of the court for a few hours, he immediately becomes disqualified at least for 6 years, sentence plus 6 years. That is section 1. Then subsection 2 says certain offences particularly pertaining to hoarding, etc. There the disqualification is attracted only if he has been convicted and for 6 months the minimum punishment. If a person has been convicted but he has not been sentenced to imprisonment for 6 months, he does not attract disqualification. Then section 3 is the general one, whatever is not specified in 1 and 2. If a person has been convicted and sentenced to imprisonment for 2 years or more, then he becomes disqualified without reference to any offence. Any offence for which conviction has resulted in the sentence of imprisonment for 2 years or more, that immediately attracts disqualification, and the period for all this is the sentence plus 6 more years. Supposing a person has been convicted and sentenced say for 2 years or 3 years, then the disqualification will run for 9 years. So if a person has been convicted and sentenced to 2 years, so it will be 6 years plus 2 years, and if for 5 years, then it will be 5 plus 6. So that is the period of disqualification. And then question is, what is the meaning of conviction? Previously there used to be some confusion that conviction means ultimately by the appellate court, and then so long as the appeal is pending, a person can merely go on contesting. Now the law is clarified by the Supreme Court. The conviction means conviction by the trial court itself. The moment the trial court has convicted a particular person and given that punishment which attracts disqualification under section 8, 1, 2 or 3, then the person is disqualified. Even if a person goes in appeal and he files the appeal, and during the pendency of that appeal the appellate court has suspended the execution of the sentence and given him or her the bail, that will not remove the disqualification. The disqualification will still be attached. But an exception to this is, which is very rare, the normal course for an appellate court is that they grant the bail and suspend the execution of the sentence, but they don't suspend the conviction itself. The Supreme Court has now clearly in another subsequent case, in this case of particularly this you must have seen this Navjot Singh Sidhu's case, they have suspended the conviction also. So where the conviction is also stayed and the execution of sentence is also stayed, bail is granted, then this means the high court's order or the lower court's order is no longer in force in any respect. So in that case only he can contest the election, but otherwise only if the bail is granted and the conviction is not stayed, the disqualification will be attracted from the date of trial court's order. Then there is just one exception in the case of sitting MLAs. They have made some special provision in section 8 subsection 4 that if on the date of conviction a person is a sitting MLA or sitting MP, on the date of conviction, maybe trial may be going on for 10 years, but when the trial court gives the final verdict, on that day if a person is a sitting MLA or sitting MP, he is convicted and otherwise under section 8 he would be disqualified. In that case, firstly the disqualification will be postponed for 3 months, not will be from the date of the trial court's order, it will be effective from 3 months afterwards. So there is a specific period for 3 months, and during that period of 3 months if he files an appeal, then the disqualification will not be, it will be further postponed, it will not be attracted. Previously the understanding of the law was that once a sitting MLA or MP has filed the appeal within 3 months, then if the court takes 10 years or 15 years to try, he will be going on contesting the elections and all that. But now that law has changed, not law has changed, the interpretation of the law has been changed by the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said yes, this facility is available, but available only for the limited period, only for the same house. Once the house is dissolved, then for future elections he can't contest on the basis of this. They have read it down, they have not struck down the provision, they have read it down, saying that this facility is available only till the existing house, and supposing in the existing house also he resigns, then he cannot contest the by election or the election, future election to the same house, unless as in the case of this Sidhu, he got a special dispensation from the Supreme Court where they even state the conviction, because he said, sir, I want to put up, I want to create a special this example, though I could take refuge under this particular section, I could continue for the whole house, but still I do not want, I will go to the electors again, and then Supreme Court said okay, you go, then he contested the by election. So this is what section 8 says. Then section 8A is not very difficult, because the election commission has to fix the period of disqualification. We circulate on the eve of every election, we circulate the list of persons who are disqualified under section 8A. Today there is no person, so this list is nil at today. So next is person section dismissal, that I have told you already. Dismissal only for two reasons, disloyalty or corruption, and if a person says I am not dismissed for corruption or disloyalty, for your purpose he is disqualified unless he produces a certificate from the election commission and produces that certificate with the nomination paper. Then next is contract. This is of course slightly tricky. Contract, particularly it should be subsisting contract, and subsisting contract means contract which is subsisting on the date of scrutiny of nominations. Previously a person may be a contractor, but on the date of scrutiny he may not be a contractor. And then Supreme Court has also said in some cases that the contract can be terminated even unilaterally also. A person may be a PWD contractor, but he may go to the engineer or whosoever was the in charge, he may say I am just terminating my contract, I will not do this job, remaining job, you can impose any penalty on me, you can have this work, remaining work done through any agency, I will be responsible for that, but I am not the contract holder. So on the date of the scrutiny you have to see whether the contract is subsisting. Then contract should be only for two things, not every contract. Only either he is supplying some goods to the government, he is maybe he is undertaking some ration card, some ration supplies are being made by the government, he has taken the ration shop, he is not supplying any goods to the government, he is only doing some service for the government, which is not a disqualification. So first is supply of goods, and then execution of works. Works the Supreme Court has defined as some construction work, not merely say this license or something else. So only where roads, buildings, dams, wherever the PWD is doing some job, that is they say that has to be given that meaning. So it is a execution of works or the supply of goods. And but another catch here, it should be with the appropriate government. Appropriate government is defined in section 7 itself. Appropriate government means if you are contesting election to the Lok Sabha, then appropriate government means central government. You may be having a contract with say Tamil Nadu government for supply of goods, and you are contesting election to the Lok Sabha, then it is not a disqualification, but for legislative assembly it is a disqualification. Similarly for legislative assembly you are contesting, you have a contract with say defense ministry of the government of India for supply of some goods, that is not a disqualification for legislative assembly's election. So appropriate government also has to be seen. Then of course I told you about this disqualification for government company. Firstly, we have said that the disqualifications in the government companies, director may be disqualified who has been appointed by the government, but not the other officers. But in the government company also, the law says only 3 posts. If you are appointed to 3 posts, maybe by the board of directors or by the own governing body, one is the manager, another is the managing agent, and the third is the secretary. If you are holding any of these 3 posts, then whosoever has made the appointment in that company, you are disqualified. So this, but here also the appropriate government, if you are contesting election to the state legislative assembly, that government company should be a state government company in which they have at least 25% share. But if you are contesting election to the Lok Sabha and you are a manager of a state government company, then you are not disqualified. Similarly, if you are a manager of a Government of India undertaking and you are contesting election to the state legislative assembly, that is not disqualified. Only for Lok Sabha is a disqualified, not for the assembly. So these are the fine distinction points. Then next, loss disqualification is not very complicated, because whosoever has not given the account of election expenses, the election commission takes care of those things. We issue a notice, then ultimately we disqualify some persons, and then we circulate a complete list of all those who are disqualified on a particular date. So you have to just see that list, but sometimes we have to be very careful about that list, because a person may be disqualified from some other constituency for the last election. Now he may be contesting election from some other constituency. So you have to be slightly careful. You have to just see whether this man, his name is not there in the list of contesting this disqualified person. So these are the qualifications and disqualifications.